What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily. So with the release of the new Samsung Galaxy S21 FE, I think everyone's biggest question is, how does it compare to the flagship S21 that it's technically based off of? After all, the S21 FE is supposed to be the flagship phone with 90% or so of its specs and features for a cheaper price. That was the idea with the S20 FE, which of course proved to be a great device for the money. But the timing and release of this new S21 FE, likely months delayed due to supply chain issues or whatever else, and almost a full year after the flagship S21, has made this new phone a questionable choice now. In this video, I'm going to give you a very objective, straightforward comparison between the new S21 FE and the flagship S21, so you can understand what specs and features are the same and what was left off the S21 FE in order to justify its cheaper retail price. And then I'm going to sort of explain why the new S21 FE maybe isn't as good of a value as the S20 FE was. And I guess if you just want the answer, I'll tell you, it's basically because the flagship S21 is a year old, it's heavily discounted, you can get it secondhand or renewed, and you could pay the same or maybe even less for the flagship phone, which is not great news for the FE. Now, physically, I originally thought these two phones were a lot more similar than they really are. You can tell they both kind of look like most mid-tier and high-end Samsung phones nowadays. The designs are close, but a few things set them apart. For one, the S21 FE is actually larger. It's a 6.4-inch device. The flagship S21 is 6.2 inches. And just to finish off the sizes, the S21 Plus is largest of them all at 6.7 inches. So the new FE falls right in the middle. Nowadays, I consider the flagship S21 to be small-ish. The S21 FE is more in line with a majority of smartphones, but size is always a personal preference, and depending on how you use your phone, you might prefer something bigger or smaller. Either way, I do consider the difference to be noticeable for sure, and likely a factor. Both phones have relatively similar borders and bezels surrounding the displays, though the flagship phone technically has a higher screen-to-body ratio, and a smaller front camera too. Not really sure why, but you can see that pretty clearly. Around back, like I said, the two phones look like any other Samsung device you'd come across from the last couple of years. Matte plastic rear covers, triple lens camera setups with a slight bump. The FE's is more of a slope. I think the flagship S21 might have a metal ring around the camera module, but it's all basically the same idea. And there's similar aluminum housings and frames too. Now you can see and feel the flagship phone is slightly thinner along the edge with a sloping tapered side. The S21 FE is a bit flatter and boxier. Also the finishes vary. The flagship is shiny and polished. The S21 FE is a color matching matte. But all in all, at a glance, these two phones are about as close as can be. Taking a look around at everything else, on the left side, nothing really on either phone, just a 5G antenna there on the FE. On the right side, the same basic volume and power buttons. Across the bottom, identical USB-C ports, downward firing speaker, and SIM card tray. And the important thing to mention here is, while the previous S20 FE had a dual SIM and SD card slot, the new S21 FE is just a SIM slot now, just like the flagship phone. So keep that in mind if you're coming from the S20 FE. Up front, there's the selfie cameras, like I mentioned, just beneath the secondary speakers and earpieces on both, and around back, that triple lens camera setup, which I'll talk about in a bit. Underneath the screen on both phones is an in-display fingerprint reader, and here we have another difference that set these phones apart. The flagship S21 offers what Samsung calls their ultrasonic fingerprint sensor, while the S21 FE has, I guess, the regular optical setup. And when you touch and hold to scan your finger and unlock the phone, you can see the speeds are relatively similar, but the advantage of the flagship S21 is that you can more quickly tap and pull away and still unlock your device. The ultrasonic sensor is certainly more capable, more accurate, and requires less of a pause, and this setup is one of the first things you'll find missing on the S21 FE. Both phones offer face unlock as well, and with this, the speed and accuracy to me feel almost the same. They kind of go back and forth depending on which one I glance at first, but all in all, I didn't see anything worth noting there. As far as the out loud listening experience is concerned, like I mentioned already, both phones do offer dual stereo speakers, the downward firing one at the bottom and the secondary one in the earpiece. I'm not aware of any changes or differences with the setup here. To me, they sound exactly the same, and here's a sample of each so you can hear it for yourself. In regards to the displays, the actual screen size technically isn't the only difference here, though generally speaking, you're actually going to get a very similar viewing experience on each phone. The smaller 6.2-inch screen on the flagship S21 is a dynamic AMOLED 2X panel, 2400 by 1080 resolution, 421 pixels per inch, 120 Hz with HDR10 Plus support. The larger S21 FE also seems to have a dynamic AMOLED panel coming in at 6.4 inches, the same 2400 by 1080 resolution, slightly lower pixel density due to its size at 411 pixels per inch, and it too is a 120 Hz display with HDR10 Plus support. Now, first off, although the flagship S21 technically has a better PPI density, that is just not something you're going to notice at all. Furthermore, aside from maybe a slight difference in max brightness, where the flagship phone seems to be able to be brighter overall, I generally can't tell much else apart between these two phones. To me, the default color profiles look to be set up and calibrated the same. No real difference in dark areas or bright whites. You can maybe get more out of the flagship S21 outdoors and direct sunlight. Like I said, I believe its peak brightness is higher, but all in all, these two phones present you with an almost identical display setup. And that's great. One of the perks of the S20 FE was a flagship caliper screen setup without the flagship price. That's most certainly what you get here with the S21 FE once again, and like I said, you also get that 120 Hz mode on both phones. So they're fast, fluid, and very responsive. Not exactly a flagship specific feature anymore by 2022 standards, but still great to have either way. All in all, you can't go wrong here. The S21 FE once again gives you a lot of bang for your buck, but like I said, maybe less of a value proposition nowadays, given how many other phones offer similar display setups. So now let's talk specs and performance. And this, I think, is where the late release of the S21 FE really wound up hurting it. Now, the flagship S21, of course, was jam-packed with 2021's high-end components. The Snapdragon 888 5G chipset, an Adreno 660 GPU, 8 GB of RAM, and 128 or 256 gigs of internal storage. With the S21 FE, it too is powered by all those same flagship caliper specs, and just like the S20 FE, the whole point here is to offer a more affordable device with still top-of-the-line internals. It's got the Snapdragon 888 5G and Adreno 660, the choice of either 6 or 8 gigs of RAM, and similar 128 or 256 gig storage options. Now, with all that being said, there's two important things to consider. First off, my S21 FE here has 6 gigs of RAM, so it's not exactly a perfect one-to-one comparison, and I'll show you that disadvantage when we do some app switching. Second, and this is probably the most important bit, the S21 FE was released basically 1 year after all these specs were quote-unquote flagship components, and that sort of kind of takes away a lot of the value of this phone. You're now no longer getting a same year flagship experience for a discount. You're instead getting 1 year old flagship components, just weeks before the new, more powerful specs come out. And yes, I realize that if you were comparing the release date of the S20 FE to this new S21 FE, it's only a matter of maybe 4 or 5 months, but that's a long time in the world of smartphones. And the newest Samsung devices are literally right around the corner. Timing is everything, and the S21 FE, I guess, just got unlucky with that. It's why I think this phone isn't as good of a buy in comparison, but I will say that for what it is, you are still getting nearly the best, most powerful Android/Samsung device you can get under $1,000. Android 12, the latest One UI update, a smooth and very responsive OS. It's plenty capable no matter what you're doing, whether that be just browsing social media or even gaming. It is very much the top-of-the-line experience you'd want. It's nearly identical to the flagship, aside from the 2 less gigs of RAM in my phone, but for all intents and purposes, the speed and performance and capabilities are all the same. Like I mentioned, the only real disadvantage maybe is with app management with 6 gigs of RAM on the S20 FE. It feels like it sort of limits it sometimes with keeping all my apps current and refreshed in the background. You can see that side by side with the flagship, but that's not a huge deal. The main point here is that, while yes, you are getting a smartphone jam-packed with top-of-the-line specs in the S21 FE, the specs are 4 to 5 months older now, and the flagship S21 is being compared to is 1 year old itself, which means the flagship phone now is cheaper, it's discounted, and it's going to see even more of a price drop in just a couple of weeks when the S22 comes out, which all in all just makes the S21 FE a tough buy right now. even with all its flagship caliper specs. When it comes to battery life, the larger S21 FE technically has a larger capacity battery inside, 4,500 milliamps versus 4,000 on the flagship S21, but with a slightly larger display, I found the longevity and performance to basically even out. I don't see either phone having a clear advantage in how long they'll last through the day, and actually even when it's time to juice up, both phones support 25-watt fast charging, 15-watt wireless charging, and offer reverse wireless charging too. So the battery and power setups here seem to be all the same. So last but not least, let's talk about the cameras. Now, weirdly enough, like I showed you earlier, the selfie camera sizes differ slightly, and the actual specs of the selfie cameras also differ too. The flagship S21 offers a 10 megapixel shooter. The S21 FE has a 32 megapixel shooter. Now, to be honest, megapixels aren't everything, and in fact, it's sort of misleading here because in my experience, the flagship S21 produces better results when we look at the images. There's slightly more detail, nicer color, and an overall better looking shot. I believe, besides the megapixel count, that the sensor size and other specs are better on the flagship phone, and that in turn gives you a better real-world result when it comes to selfies. With the rear lens setup, everything here is actually more similar. The main lens on both phones is a 12 megapixel shooter. The telephoto lens differs. The flagship packs a 64 megapixel setup, the S21 FE is an 8 megapixel zoom lens, and the ultra-wide specs are similar too, 12 megapixels each way, but a slightly different field of view by about 3 degrees. The slight hardware variations don't tell the whole story though. Capability-wise, the flagship S21 offers things like 8K video recording and director's mode that the S21 FE doesn't have, but actually most everything else, the features, the shooting modes, and the capabilities are identical across the camera apps. They're actually a lot more similar than I originally thought they'd be, and that's great, though you will still get slightly more pro capabilities on the flagship phone. But let's dive into some real-world results. Now, generally speaking, both phones take great pictures, but there's like 3 to 4 consistent things you can pick out. I personally feel as though the flagship S21 offers the more detailed picture, ever so slightly, but it's there when you look closely. I also think the S21 FE offers a slightly more colorful, more saturated default look compared to the flagship. You can see that with certain shots, especially with like the sky and the water here. The wide angle lens is noticeably better on the flagship phone. It's brighter, there's more dynamic range, it's more detailed. You can also get a slightly different focal length with portrait mode on each phone too, and that gives you a bit of a different look with the background and foreground separation. Overall, the S21 FE is a super capable device with a very robust and feature-packed camera setup, but in my opinion, it still falls a bit short compared to the flagship S21, both in overall capabilities and with everyday results. It's not a huge difference, it may not even be a deciding factor really, but it is a difference nonetheless. Now, I've already sort of explained my issue with the S21 FE, but let me hit you with some concrete numbers here just to drive my point home. The S21 FE was no doubt launched some 4 to 5 months later than it should have been, and it's coming out less than a month or so before Samsung's S22 flagship phones are likely to be announced. Its counterpart, the flagship S21, is almost a year old itself, and because of all that, you can snag it at a huge discount. Both brand new from your favorite carrier and secondhand and renewed from places like Amazon. The retail price of the S21 FE is $699. Though actually, Amazon is already discounting it to $599 right now. The flagship S21 was technically a $799 device, but savvy shoppers can pick it up now for, well, closer to $500, and in some cases a bit under. The S21 FE is for the savvy shopper looking to get the best, most capable phone for a good price, but when you actually start to shop around, it's suddenly overpriced by comparison, and that's solely due to its unlucky release. If you're deciding between the S21 FE and the flagship S21 right now, in my opinion, it just makes way more sense to grab the flagship instead. You get a full flagship phone for not just a huge discount, but perhaps even for a cheaper price than the S21 FE. It's a weird thing for sure right now, but it's the end result of a poor release cycle and the inevitable and steep depreciation of most Samsung flagships too. But what do you guys guys think? Is there any reason to grab the S21 FE right now? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.